Welcome to the Filmmaker and Fans podcast. In this week's episode, we explore the 2019 film Jojo Rabbit, written and directed by Taika Waititi. Using Jojo Rabbit as our foundation, we explore topics such as the importance of perspective in storytelling, the balance between satire and drama, and the audience expectations in historical movies. As a reminder, if you're enjoying these podcasts, give it a follow, give it a subscribe, and let us know you're listening. Hope you enjoy.
There's so much to talk about, and politics are a thorny thing to get into, particularly in these times. So I think I'd love to take the approach of us discussing the relationship of art to politics and to history and to culture. Of history, first of all. When we look at films like Oppenheimer, less so with Barbie, maybe more so with Zone of Interest and other films, the question, I guess, for me as a filmmaker and for everybody is, do we learn about history from movies or do we learn about it from first-person narratives or from books or from accumulation of various sources to try to make a determination about what occurred and what didn't? If we rely on fiction to be our reference for history, then I would conjecture we're all in deep trouble, because that's not the function of fiction. Now, that's not to say that fiction doesn't give us a perspective on history, but the difference between perspective and reporting. I think fiction gives us a perspective. It makes us reinterpret historical things, and by reinterpret, have a better understanding of what happened then and what's happening now in other people's lives and our own lives. So if every film about the Second World War and the Holocaust has to report along particular limited channels, then we're incapable of making art about anything that is significant. We can only make about art things that are innocuous or innocent. I fully get the idea of historical revisionism. That is, if someone in a fictive piece retells history completely, Holocaust deniers, for example, people like that, whatever it is, and then reframe things and say, oh, well, here's a fiction that will supplant a reality, I understand that's a slippery slope and a dangerous thing. But at the same time, don't we have an obligation as artists and to artists to say, take any historical episode and then, well, identifying it clearly as living in a fictive universe, then interpret that experience to make it resonant and significant for a contemporary audience. So if he was to ridicule the Holocaust and say it was a joke, it's hilarious, or the Second World War or the murders of people who are in opposition to Nazism, I get it, and those things kind of happen. But I would say there are incidents within the film, within the context of the film, that are so deeply disturbing. Having built an empathic bridge to Scarlett Johansson, for example, is this hugely sympathetic character who, spoiler alert, is hung ruthlessly. We don't even see her hanging, just her own child discovering it. I think that resonates with us and then goes to how horrible these people were. And ultimately, the film is about a child's interpretation of an inaccessible adult world. And a child doesn't understand the real horrors of the adult world. They have a childlike understanding of the adult world. And by making it childlike, things become games and relationships and light and noise, not things that are ruthless and tragic and existential. So as a piece of art, I think it can be defended by saying this is a child's perspective. As a piece of historical fiction, I realize that's more thorny, because if it no longer means that the Holocaust is as resident, the Second World War is as resident, and the existence of Nazis is as resident, and that is diminished, then the filmmaker's done a great disservice. I err on the side of giving artists greater freedom to interpret experiences while clearly saying this is not an historical document, it is a fictional interpretation.
So I'd love to stay and talk about audience expectation here for a second. So the tone of this movie is this balance between satire and drama. And there was a really polarized response from critics because of this balance, and there were camps that didn't like either side of of that balance. So I think contemporary audiences, we have this expectation of war movies, for example. So are contemporary audience expectations something that you factor in whenever you're choosing a project?
Yeah, I did the film about Dylan Thomas, and I got major criticism because it said it wasn't an accurate portrayal of his death. It wasn't meant to be an accurate portrayal. And then someone said, well, how dare you? This is one of the greatest poets, lyric poets of the mid-century. How dare you change his life? Well, none of us were there. So we don't know exactly what his life was. But I'm not trying to create a piece that says, like going to Williamsburg and saying, here's what it was like in colonial times. That's not the function of art, I think. That's not the function of films. We're not doing reportage. We're doing reinterpretation and giving audiences new perspectives on things from our shared zeitgeist, new perspectives. And one of the ways to do that is not only playing with content, but with form. So when we talk about war films, for example, is the beach scene in Saving Private Ryan, which is so talked about, where they use 6 frames and change the shutter angle so it's jerky. Yes, in that sort of subjective perspective, it's very disturbing and terrifying. And soldiers have said that's realistic. But when they get into the relationships and the dialogue, have they commented on that? And then we get into this analysis of what is realistic and what is film's relationship to realism. Because I'll tell you this, having a close-up of your friend and then a close-up of you, and then cutting to a wide shot, having a crane shot, playing music and having visual effects isn't the way the world works. I don't see the world in a shot in reverse. I don't see montages in my experience of the world. I don't see steady cam shots. Should everything be a steady cam because we move through the world? We're not stationary. Well, that's interesting because people who've studied physiology say that what actually happens is we don't see the world as shaking the way it is in Saving Private Ryan, or we don't see the world moving the way it is with a steady cam. In fact, the eye takes a series of still images and puts them together, and we see the world with a stability, even during movement, that we don't portray in film. But we have a device that we now recognize as representative of realism, which is a handheld camera, a jerky camera, and we say that's the way we experience the world. If it is, we'd be nauseous all the time. It's a convention that we've agreed upon. So is our treatment of shot and reverse. So is our treatment of music. So is our treatment of titles. So is our treatment of historical fiction, which is we'll have people talking, and then how will they talk? Well, if it's a revolutionary era period, they'll speak an oldie worldy language, and if they're Europeans and it's in Germany, they're speaking in English but with a funny accent. Well, people in Germany actually turns out speak in German. So it's simply a convention that we've agreed upon, which we find acceptable. So then it all comes down to what is an acceptable convention and what isn't. Are films meant to be told in a linear way with a beginning, middle, and the end? Well, Proust and Faulkner and others have said that's not the way you actually experience the world. When you sit in your room or lying in your bed at night, you're thinking of the past, you're thinking of the future, and you're imagining the present, which you don't fully experience correctly. So it all becomes this odd amalgam. That's the way you really experience the world, not the way the film portrays it. So my conjecture is that all films are surrealism. None of them actually represent the way we ordinarily experience the world. And therefore, all films can do and should do anything they want in terms of a narrative plasticity, juxtaposition of events, putting people in funny wardrobe, having them talk in different accents, having imagined representations of Hitler appear in a boy's room. I don't believe that anybody at the end of that movie saw Hitler as a comic character. And if they did, I would hope they would have enough maturity to look up and see that he actually murdered millions of people and was a monster beyond all reason. Because you see the film, do you see that Hitler's kind of a good guy? No. Now, to be fair, people would say if we don't keep certain things as sacred or sacrosanct, then we risk diminishing it. And if in a film, and while recognizing that an artist has some plasticity, if they diminish things that are part of our shared iconography, and diminish their significance, then again, that's a slippery slope. Then suddenly we're not so frightened of Nazis because they're obnoxious and crazy, but they're not really as dangerous as Hitler was. So I do get both sides of the argument. And in this particular film, it is problematic. But I would say generally, we have to allow artists considerable latitude so they can have the courage and the license to press out into human experience beyond which we find conventional or safe.
So you mentioned earlier about how the point of view of this movie is through Jojo's eyes. It's through the child's eyes. So how do you think point of view affects an audience's connection to the story?
Great question, because it really is. We can do it various ways. Look, we cannot be, there can be this omnipotence in the audience. They see everything, and everything presented to them is objective. And the audience's truth is the character's truth. And it's very simple, and this person has this obstacle, they've got to overcome it. It's an action film. We know where the bad guys are, who the good guys are, what has to be exploded, removed, overcome for the heroes on their particular journey to achieve their ends. But what becomes more interesting is our own experience of the world, getting to this idea of what realism is as opposed to naturalism. Naturalism is just a frame by frame, object by object replication of the world. That's naturalism. I would conjecture that realism is something different. Realism goes to our individual experiences of the world. So if something's to be realistic in a movie, it has to be the way a person experiences the world, which is not objectively, not omnipotently, but subjectively, full of our own limitations, predispositions, and misperceptions. And the best filmmakers, Scorsese is a great example of this. If you look at a film like Goodfellas, when Ray Liotta is going into the club with the girl trying to impress her, it's one long shot of everyone tugging on their forelock and bowing and scraping and paying him respect and courtesy and homage. And we feel, as the character does as audience, how cool is it to be brought in through a private entrance and feted and worshipped and given the best club in the table as if we're important. It's what we all seek, which is validation. Are we to believe that all of us then want to become gangsters? I don't think so. But what Scorsese is going to is that to understand a character, you have to see the world through that character's eyes. To understand anyone, you have to see the world through that character's eyes. And as artists, if we can teach our audience that to see things through other people's eyes gives us a better understanding of people and the situations of history, then we have done some great service. So if we were to understand the appeal of fascism to someone who is mentally immature, then we come to an understanding of many political movements. Because it's not what a movement represents intellectually that is significant about it, because rarely is it intellectuals who are going to determine the success or failure of a movement. It's rather the visceral appeal of that movement to those who are not evolved, well-read, or emotionally immature, or are infantilized by the way they mediate the world or are themselves children. So when we look at Jojo Rabbit and we say to Jojo, the idea of fitting in with the other Nazis who make him feel foolish at the beginning of the film is something that all of us can identify with. And that doesn't mean it's justifiable, but it's recognizable, which is when you have a powerful movement that's all pervasive, however pernicious that movement, people want to be a part of it because people don't want to be excluded from the society of which they are meant to be a part. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes me think of writing and character development and building empathy as you're creating these characters. So do you actually have any sort of process or specific approach that you use to build that empathy or or really get to know those characters while writing?
What I'll do is I enter into a social contract with myself, which is whenever I'm writing a character, I believe that characters see themselves as heroic. All my characters in every one of my films believes they are individually heroic. They believe they're victims. They believe they're badly treated by other characters. They believe they deserve whatever they get. They feel unjustly punished. But I never write a character as a villain. And I never write a character as seeing themselves as flawed. I think that they all, as we all believe, that we're heroic. If we do something bad, we have good reasons for doing those bad things that we did. If someone is angry with us, they are unjustly angry with us, or they should forgive us. So in my new film, in GRQ, when I was writing the main character, and he's stealing from people, and he's lying, and he's cheating, I wrote a long series of notes to myself about all the reasons he's doing this. Why is he lying to his wife? Because if he told her the truth, she would be upset. And if she was upset, she would be unhappy. Therefore, by lying to her, he was making her happy. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable chain of thoughts. Now, it may be a bad chain of thought. It may be a bad thing to do, but it's logical in many ways of thinking, which is if you don't want to upset someone, don't say something that's upsetting to them. So he doesn't want to upset his wife. As for the money he's risking all their life savings on this crypto deal. To his mind, it has a better than 50% chance of succeeding. And if it does, he's going to buy his wife all these wonderful things. So why tell her the truth that he's risking all their money and they have no money if it's just going to upset her? And anyway, when he gets all the money at the end, she's going to be so rich she's not going to think about these things. So why not just wait till he can give her something before he gives her the bad news? I wrote the character that way, and it completely changed everything he said when I had that philosophy, because he's heroic. Now, I then wrote the wife's character, forgetting as best I could everything I had written about the husband with Mina. And I thought, here's a guy who lies to you all the time. He's your husband, and you've had a child together, and you're stuck together. And now he's telling you all these things. They don't sound true. But if you challenge him, he's going to get upset, and he's going to argue, and he's going to get depressed, and he's not going to do anything to get you out of the mess you're in. So maybe it's best not to say anything at all. So now I'm writing her scene with this same character from her perspective. Then I combine the two in an interaction, keeping in mind all the time what both are thinking, internal monologues. And it informs everything that happens in this script and every other script that I wrote. I write every character as if they believe they are the hero of the narrative.
This is interesting. So just to stay on this for a second and to clarify, are you saying that you developed his character first completely and wrote his side of the dialogue and then came back to it, developed her character, wrote her side of the dialogue, and then put them together?
Absolutely right. I did a scene where he speaks to her, but as he hears her, not as what she says, because it's wholly from his perspective. I imagined I was him. I changed my voice. I changed what I wore that day, to be honest. I imagined every possible way in backstory. I created a whole bunch of backstories about events that happened in his life. I was him. I was this character. And then I was imagining that he was telling the story to a friend, at a restaurant about how crazy his wife was. And I wrote the scene that way and kept it, put those pages aside. So about a week later, I imagined I was her. I imagined in every possible respect what it would be like to be a woman with a guy like that. And then I wrote the same scene entirely from her perspective, based on what she said. And of course, what would happen is both would have the other person saying different things because that's what they were hearing. And then when I combined it, it became really interesting. But the dynamic was much better than if I wrote with a specific intention in mind and then was kind of manipulating these characters to say the polemical things I wanted them to say to force my perspective on the audience. Rather, I had two fully realized complex characters, each with their own agendas, and each fully correct in some things and fully wrong in other things. That's what I mean by subjective analysis and the creation of characters that are complex and genuine. And that's what I mean by reality as opposed to naturalism. I'm not trying to create a world which basically serves my agenda, but only appears to be real. What I do instead is have competing ideas full of complexities and uncertainties, just like the world really is. Now, I can't say what happens between every single man and every single woman, but I can tell you this, or every single couple, be it a same sex couple or otherwise. I can tell you this: every argument is partially predicated on both characters misremembering what the other characters said or done, both people misperceiving what the other person is doing, both behaving with agendas which they think are virtuous, and both facilitating the argument.
It's such a unique way of going about it. Is there any residue left over for you? Like, is there anything left over for you personally after going deep into these characters and developing in that way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and the relationship between Carolyn and I, our relationship is partially represented in these dynamics. And Carolyn and I were just arguing this morning slightly about whether the main character is sympathetic or not at the beginning of the film. He's very sympathetic by the end, but there's this huge, surprising turn in GRQ which no one anticipates. But I think he's hugely sympathetic because I get him because I wrote him. She won't see him sympathetic at the beginning of the film because she's had people lie to her. I do my withholding. There are things when we're going to go over budget on something, and I think I will not tell her tonight at 11 o'clock. I'll tell her maybe tomorrow, but not right now. I can't deal with the flack. Who amongst us, who's not a saint, hasn't done that very thing? So I'm very aware of it, and when Carolyn's very angry, she'll tell me that I'm like the character. So the residue is everywhere. If you're a genuine artist, I mean, if you're fully dedicated to your craft, you're, God bless Taylor Swift, you naturally bring your life to your art. You can't help but do it. So every observation, every experience that I have infuses my art with meaning. And everything I do in my art, because it fully fills my life, every pore, every moment, every breath I take when I'm making a movie is about my movie. So at the end of it, how can I not be changed or affected? I am profoundly. And I do find myself speaking like Marlon, the lead character of the film, or being sympathetic or not sympathetic, or defending people. Here's one of the things that transformed me. I'm more inclined to defend people who do pernicious things in what they think is the service of the greater good now than I did before I made the film. Because I had the character defend himself so often and so vigorously that ultimately his argument was effective with me. An argument that I self created. I'm like a puppeteer, where suddenly, in one of those horror films where the little hand puppet starts talking to you in your dreams. So my little hand puppet started talking to me, and I started thinking, yeah, okay, he's well-intentioned. He's under enormous pressure. The clock's ticking. He doesn't have time to explain, so he lies. Not a good thing, but an understandable thing.
So I want to shift a little bit and talk about directing style. So Taika Waititi wrote and directed this, and he adapted it from a book. And everything that we've been talking about so far is because it came through his perspective. It came through his decision making, and it was from his style that the movie that we know and that we've seen is what it is. So I'm curious, are there any certain directing styles, whether it be process or just ways of going about working, that are better suited for specific story types?
Good question. I don't think so. I'm such a evangelist as regards wanting to encourage directors to free themselves of the limitation of conventional form. I think this is the most pernicious philosophic problem for contemporary directors, which is the belief that there's a way that scripts should be written and that stories should be told. And it begins in part with our discussion already about what is realism, what is realistic, because there's this desire to build a bridge between the fictive world of film and our ordinary world. And one of those bridges is to say, look, what we have on the screen is just like the world you inhabit. Even when you're doing a superhero film, you still want the superheroes to have eccentricities and vulnerabilities and failures of core competencies to represent that these are people just like you, because if they're not people just like you, we don't have an empathic connection to them and we don't care about them. So one of the things every director does is try to build an empathic connection between audience and character. So I would suggest that it's a skill set that all directors need, which is recognizing what is the most positive representation of the human condition that will appeal to audiences, which I think is vulnerability and weakness and failure core competencies, skill sets. So that's one thing. As for individual directing styles for individual genres, I would further conjecture that directors like Latimos, for example, in Poor Things, which we talked about the other day, in this film, in even, I would say, Lost in Translation, people who are willing to bend or Enter the Void, Gaspard Noise, so many others. People who are willing to recognize that the physical represented world, fictive world of a film, is something that is capable of surviving manipulation and, in fact, is stronger for it. I think the specific function of a director, of any artist, is to take the world and to alter it in such a way that we see it as if for the first time, to see it clearly. And if we're just doing a objective documentary representation of the world, then the audience is not going to be shocked into new perspectives. But if we did a film like Moulin Rouge, for example, where we're combining songs and we take contemporary images with old images, or Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, another one of his films, same thing, where these odd whiplash juxtapositions of seemingly contradictory ideas, I think it stimulates us because we want, partially, to have an ordinary physical conventional world. And when directors intentionally violate that convention, I think it makes us look at everything with fresh eyes. And so many important contemporary directors are doing that, and I think it's important that they are. Even Barbie is basically a completely surreal exercise. And it's effective because of its surrealism. Dolls don't speak. Barbie doesn't really have a playhouse, but we delight in it because what we see is the humanity of Barbie inhabiting this surreal world. So we have a real woman with real limitations and virtues and complexities in a tableau that is conventional, although not a convention that we recognize as our own, but full of conventions that come from the ordinary world. It's surrealism. And this Jojo Rabbit is surrealism. Moulin Rouge is full of surrealism. Poor Things is full of surrealism. So this juxtaposition of the real and the surreal, or using surrealism to comment on the ordinary world, I think is significant. So to your question, I don't think that there's a type of style that applies to a particular genre. But I do think that directors willing to experiment with form are inclined to have a greater impact on audience than those who aren't. And I think most audiences are tired of conventional form. I think they're exhausted by it. And what happens with all advanced art forms is as audiences become tired with convention, they revel in the experimentation. So it happened in painting, it happened in music, it happened in dance, it happened in the novel. All form changes because we go tired of conventional.
So this is interesting. This isn't a note or anything, but do you kind of a relevant hot take of the film industry right now? Do you think that there are outlets for filmmakers and artists that are looking to create things in that way, especially with the current landscape of traditional kind of plug and play processes like you've talked about before?
Look at The Curse, which is kind of a brilliant bit, the Safdie brothers' Curse, because we talked the other day about, just the other day, about Uncut Gems. They were involved in the writing of The Curse, which is utter surrealism. I mean, so unconventional and mad and strange, but you still recognize the human condition, but it's juxtaposed with such an unusual take on the experience of the world, the experience of these characters wholly differently than you would if it was a more conventionally telling of an ordinary narrative. The Bear, I think, has a lot of convention in it, but the energy with which it's cut and edited goes for this idea of a perspective that has more to do with our individual psychological perspective than just an objective camera held at some distance. So there's many examples of films right now that are using these methodologies. I think more so, maybe, than any time in cinematic history. Certainly in the 60s, there was some experimentation, but there's actually oddly more. A lot of people are bemoaning the fate of the film world right now. I'm excited by it. I think some of the most exciting films of the last 30 years are being made right now. I think The Bear, although it's episodic television, is kind of a masterpiece. Mum, kind of a conventional British TV show, is absolutely, superb. End of the Effing World was a masterpiece. Ordinary People, One Day, another really interesting TV series. There's so much. Funny Woman, not Funny Girl, but Funny Woman, a British TV series. Again, very interesting takes on lots of things. Then you just go back to simple films like Shaun of the Dead, which is why I'm so interested in horror films and in comedies, is that somehow horror filmmakers and comedy filmmakers feel they have absolute license to do anything they want with the form because it's a horror film and a comedy and not a serious film. So you have people breaking the fourth wall. You have things like, hilarious zombies, all the rules being altered. Same thing in comedy. Woody Allen and Annie Hall having someone turn and speak directly to the camera about Marshall McLuhan and say, don't you just ever wish when someone's been pontificating that Marshall McLuhan was there? Well, I happen to have Marshall McLuhan, and he pulls him on to put the guy behind him in line. Correct. It's a wonderful moment, yeah. But what it is what we should recognize. Surrealism. Midnight in Paris. Surrealism. As I said, Poor Things, surrealism. Enter the Void, surrealism. All, I think, some of the most interesting films currently being made are using surrealistic techniques for the examination of form and freeing the filmmaker to use film to make it more effective rather than simply storytelling.
So this actually feeds into the last piece that I have. I want to talk about production design a little bit, because I don't think we've talked about it that much, and I don't actually think production design is talked about as a theme or a discussion point very often. So the world in this movie is just full of vibrant colors and stylized shots, and it's very opposite to what a typical World War II movie would be, or what we're used to. And production design is a really big piece of that puzzle for this film. So can you talk a bit about how production design is used to elevate narrative in film?
You talked about my methodology. Let me tell you how I make my own films, and other people I know make it this way as well. I start with lots of columns. So I'll have a scene. I'll say, okay, I've got this scene. And the characters are going to be doing these things. So that gets written down, what the action is. Next column is camera. I start thinking, okay, composition. Do I want to do this in a wide shot? The way Woody Allen does in Annie Hall in Manhattan, where the camera's just locked. Characters will go in and out of frame and the camera doesn't move. Why does he do that? Because, again, going back to the ideas of Bazin and other film philosophers, Woody Allen feels that we don't experience the world by close-up, over the shoulder. We just see the world objectively, and things move in and out of our field of view, and that's more realistic. And it also allows the actors to play off each other's rhythms, and the rhythms of the speech become more natural if there's no cutting. So he likes to do things in single wide shots. So I have to decide as I approach the scene, am I going to do this as a single wide shot and let the actors establish the rhythms, or am I going to do a lot of editing? I'm a big fan of editing, and I don't mind that manipulation. I don't think it distances audience. But I do like the actors talking simultaneously and overlapping each other, which creates technical problems, because if in one take they're overlapping on the third world and another take they're overlapping on the fourth world, you try to cut them together, it doesn't cut. So what I do is I use lots of cameras at the same time. 2 cameras on either side, 1 camera from above, 1 camera from 50-50. And then even if we only use 1 take, I've got 5 versions of that take, which will cut together perfectly because the stumbles or the improvisations all come in the same place. Also, it gives me tons to work with in the editing room. And like Scorsese, I love constructing the film in the editing room because I have complete control, no pressure, not 200 pairs of eyes looking at me all thinking they're better directors than I am. Just me in the editing room with the editor saying, let's try this, let's try that. We have that angle. Ask this character a key question. Rather than seeing the character's face, what if we stay behind them so the audience wonders what they're feeling? I love stuff like that. Pauses, which I think are really important. When I've got lots of angles, particularly when I'll have the actor say, just look this way, Greg or Mina, don't say anything. Now think this, think that, don't say anything. I love the pauses, and I can cut them in at any time. I can do that all in the editing and writing lots of stuff. So all that goes on my second column. How will I cover the sequence? Lighting. I then think, okay, again, do I want everything lit clearly? Or is this a dramatic romantic scene where I just want to do backlight and not see their faces? Or do I want to use shadows so I can't see their faces? Do I want dappled lights so they can move in and out of shadow, which creates great drama and visceral emotion in the audience? Next column, production design. Now, do I want bright, garish, saturated colors, which generally are associated with comedy, but also with surrealism? Or do I create a more soothing palette of pastels and desaturated colors that I prefer? Do I want objects on the wall that represent parts of their backstory or props that they can use, which are significant to them? If they had lost a child, for example, and this is the ball the child played with the child, the mother picks it up during the conversation. Does it suggest an idea to the audience? Can I use it in that way? So production design and props, and then wardrobe. I think about the meanings of all those things. So what I do is I believe in this philosophy of semiology and structuralism, that everything is to do with signifier and signify. The signified is the idea, the signifier is the object, the lighting, the camera movement. I haven't mentioned camera movement. I push in on something, creates an emotion, pull back, reduces that emotion. I've got all those mechanisms. But unless I focus about them individually, it tends to get very sloppy. Now, the dialogue will carry it. This is in the script. So I write entire scripts, or do passage in the script. I just say, tell the story, create the emotions with the camera movement, create the emotions with the lighting, create the emotions with the production design, create ideas with production design, create ideas with the camera movement, and the same thing with sound, same thing with music. Now I've got, in the end, 12 columns of 12 individual areas of art, and each one having their own arc where they affect audiences in different ways over the course of the film, and each orchestrated to modify, subvert, or support the other 11 columns. Now that seems very complicated, but it's so much fun. Do I use all those notes in the end, including the actor's backstory, so I can give them notes about other ones? No, I don't use them all. But I use a lot of them, and even when I don't use them, it stimulates me to think about things, about how I could treat. I've done whole scenes where I've written long dialogue, and then I think, you know what? It'll be better if the character doesn't speak, just looks off in the distance enigmatically. The camera slowly pushes in the face and says nothing. So the audience has to figure out what he's saying, which will be more powerful than the dialogue that I wrote. So that's how I use production design and lighting and camera movement and music and editing and post-production sound and all the rest of it. Everything is a series of meanings that we create that will impact our.
It's so interesting. Let's stay on the production designer then for a second and talk about the actual role. So you personally, whenever you're working on a project, and so just for those that don't know, the timeline of a project, these roles come in and out at different entry points for the overall timeline of the project. They're not all involved or on board with the project from start to finish, like say the director would be. So when you're working with a production designer and when you're hiring somebody, how do you approach it? Do you have a list and do you have ideas of things that you want to do for your project, and then you bring that to that person and see what they think and get their thoughts? Or do you kind of hand over your headline thoughts and vision to them to then come to the table with ideas?
Guide and inspire are the terms I use. Guide and inspire. Of the two, inspiration is much more important than guidance. But you have to have an individual vision to begin. So when I'm doing my 11 columns, I am inspiring myself about how I want to treat my film. But then when I meet with my cinematographer, production designer, my actors, I give them backstory. I explain what the film is about, what the sequence is about, and what I'm trying to do. And then I'll always say, and here are some suggestions. Let's say with the actors and with the department heads. And I'll say, but I am first and foremost a facilitator and collaborator more so than a martinet and employer. So you know what my intentions are, you know what my inspiration and antecedents are, and take some time and come back to me with your own thoughts. And then what always happens, and by the way, I'm going to say, and take risks. You are protected. I love risks and I will celebrate them. And then I have a habit, an habituation on set. I will always praise people, come up with good ideas. I will always give people credit for their work. I will even give them credit for my work, and I won't criticize anyone on the set. No actor, no crew member, no criticism whatsoever. particularly if they take wild risks which fail, which I love and will praise. So then the production designer comes back to me with crazy ideas saying, hey, like on GRQ, why don't we build a set, and then outside the window of the set will be other sets, and we can put those on wheels. So whenever our main character is in the set speaking to someone, we can wheel away one of the sets outside the window, put another set there, and it will look like they're speaking to each other. It's hard to explain to see the movie. It's wild and crazy. You've seen it, and it works magically because rather than two characters speaking via a television set or via phone, they're just looking at each other, and it's surreal and magical. That came in part from my production designer because I want them to take risks. What a director does is this, most important. You've got to love and lead. You've got to make people feel utterly safe, nurtured, protected, facilitated, and believed in. You can't doubt. You can't micromanage. You can't criticize. If you are so wise or so foolish as to hire someone, then you are wedded to them for the rest of that film. And you've got to make them be the best version of themselves. And how can anyone be the best version of themselves? When they're safe, when they're encouraged to take risks. What I'll always say, like I said to my composer in the last film, what did you always want to do on a film? Do it now. If my film was terrible, how could you make it great? And they do that. And so the production designer will do crazy things, float things. And then, of course, I am the ultimate arbiter. If they come back with something that's going to cost $10 million in the first week of shooting, I'm probably going to say, great idea. Can we do it for less? But the surrealism thing is so important to all this, which is the idea that we all plug ourselves into these boxes of behaviors and correct habituations and orthodoxies and rules. I think that's the thing that subverts great action the most, not just great direction, action of all parts. There's lateral thinking. I'm a big fan of Edward de Bono and this idea that linear thinking or thinking that one thing always follows another is pernicious. I don't think it's something we should do. I think instead, particularly as directors, we have to see the world as a place that can be radically understood and radically reconstructed and repurposed to give our audiences a different view than they would have of more conventional treatments. But because films cost so much money, and because we're all freelancers, and because we can lose work more easily than we can get it, it creates a fear in everyone. And fear leads to conservative behavior, and conservative behavior in the arts leads to failure. So it's self-defeating, our art form, because fear eats our souls, and fear is the currency that most of us deal with every single day.